So just like my last couple videos, this is going to start off by milling up some lumber. This project is going to be solid cherry. So this is actually 8/4 slabs. I ended up taking them down to about 1.5 inches, and like the rest of my videos that use hardwood, I have a more in-depth video on my channel showing you how I mill lumber using a planer, a planing jig, which essentially turns your planer into a jointer, as well as a jointing jig for the table saw for people that don't have a lot of tools. So if you want to see how I did this, that's a much longer video getting into it. It's linked in the description. So this thicker cherry is going to turn into the rails for the table. This is actually a coffee table, but it's essentially almost the size of a kitchen table. So I had to take these down pretty decently in order to get to nice clean lumber. The other lumber I'm using, which I'm jointing on my jointing jig right now, was 4/4 cherry, and that will be for the tabletop and most of the rest of the pieces. So once I had all my lumber planed and jointed, I trimmed it down to rough size because these were the tabletop has to be 66 inches long, and these were long enough that it wasn't worth gluing up the entire length. So I just marked them all and then ripped down the edges on my radial arm saw. So then I could line them all up, and I definitely gauge the end grain to make sure that the table will cup in the cupping will offset each other, so the curves of the grain should be every other board flipped in the opposite direction. But also for my glue ups, I also do an aesthetic glue up, so obviously the nicer parts I'm gonna cheat towards the top. So this glue up is pretty self-explanatory. I recently bought some longer pipe clamps probably a year ago, and they've been invaluable in the shop. I do ones on bottom and ones on top to try and keep it flat, but then I also add these cawls on either end and in between in order to get a nice flat top. In small shops like this where you don't have a lot of nice tools, it's really hard to get those boards perfectly flat without a jointer and a big plane. So using those cawls really helps. Once I let it set up overnight, I come through with a hand plane, and there's a couple high spots. This glue up was pretty nice. There wasn't a ton, and I'll take those down. So then next I'm going to be putting a breadboard on both ends of this table. So I'm just ripping it down to rough size, and then I'm making a special jig that allows you to route the edges of your table so that the routing line on top and bottom is going to be the exact same distance set off from the edge of the table. This is invaluable when it comes time to put the breadboard on, because you won't have to worry about the top and the bottom of the breadboard sides not meeting. I'm also going to go through making the breadboard fairly quickly because last week I released a video, again a much more in-depth video. I do that to make these build videos a lot shorter and to reduce redundancies in every video of doing the exact same thing. So if you want to see how I made this breadboard, that in and of itself is like a 20-minute video, and I'll link it eventually in my description. I have to do that this week. So with that jig in place, you can see that I can now route the top of my board. With this method, I have a downcut spiral bit so I get no tear out on the edge of that board. And then I don't show it, I think, in this clip, but I then used a straight cut bit to remove the rest. But someone in the description of last week's video recommended a handheld electric planer, which I think I might try because this build will have another breadboard. So then I could go through and turn my long tenon here into a haunched tenon, which will allow for seasonal movement but actually still secure the rigidity of the edge of the board. And so I just remove 1 inch on either side of the board so that it's hidden by the breadboard. If you want to see the tenon at the edge of the breadboard, some people like that, you could leave that flush on both sides. And then I just split this up into 4-inch sections and then add a 3/4 inch haunch right at the end of the table. So then I could go through and remove that, and this board ended up being that tenon ended up being about 36 inches wide, so I got away with it broke into perfect 4-inch sections. I could go through with a coping saw and remove that excess. You could see I'm keeping that 3/4 inch haunch, the end of the tenon intact, just removing those pieces. This way, instead of that tenon acting like one entire piece and then the whole piece being subjected to seasonal movement, those 4-inch tenons will break it up a bit. It won't move as much in that breadboard. So then I could go through and mark where I'm going to cut those mortises, and to cut the haunch, I'm lowering the breadboards onto a 1/4 inch dado stack, and I could cut that haunch, raising the blade, and at the end, since it's a curved blade, I just have to remove a little bit of that excess cherry at the end of the boards. So you can see I'm left with a nice groove. And then to cut the deeper mortises, I have to use a drill press because this is like a 5-inch breadboard, so these mortises were pretty deep. And I just go through and drill a bunch of holes, one next to the other. You're left with a little bit of excess lumber in there. And once again, I could go through with a chisel and remove it, and also a drill. The drill works really well to clean it up and remove material fairly quickly on these boards. You can see how nice and clean that mortise hole is, and then that's one that I haven't done yet. So then I could dry fit this in place. This one went on pretty well. There was a little bit of a gap, and it turned out I had to just trim down one part of my haunch. So I thought I was filming when I didn't. So these are going to be 3/8-inch dowel holes, and then I'm just marking them because I'm going to draw bore these boards. So I'm drilling a little north of that hole, so that when I go to put that board in place, you can see it's off center there. It will actually pull that breadboard into the table, and then I'm just elongating those holes, and you can see this is the dry fit. I still haven't permanently attached this breadboard, and I keep it long to the end because I really bang up stuff in my shop, so it's easier to bang up the edges of the breadboard and not the tabletop. So then it came time to start working on the base, and on my last project I kind of bit the bullet and ended up ordering legs, so I counted my losses and just ordered them from the beginning here. These are 3-inch cherry legs. This saves a lot of time. It's a lot cheaper to buy them, the legs, for me at least, because to get the stock to be able to make the legs would cost a lot of money. So I just planed those down, and those are ready to go. So this is that 1.5-inch board from the beginning. This was really nice live edge cherry, and it seems like a shame to cut it down, but that is the nature of the beast. So I just use a level to get a straight edge on that cherry, straight enough that I could send it through my jointing jig without having to send it through with 30 passes. So I have somewhat of a straight line on that live edge now, and you could see I could send through the jointing jig and get a nice straight line on that cherry, so I could rip this up into rails. With that pre-cut straight line, I only had to send it through like 3 times. And then the rails for this table are going to be pretty skinny. They're only about 2 1/4, but that is where the thickness comes in. You could get away with making thinner rails if the thickness is there to hold up that tabletop. So to cut the mortises in my table legs, I already had most of these pre-marked, and the customer wanted the aprons of this flush with the edge of the table. So these mortises are going to be really close to the edge, which is not my necessarily preferred method, just because you're left with some fairly thin stock at the edge, but aesthetically that's what we were going for. So this mortise hole is going to be centered close to the edge, and with that it's like 1.5 inch thick material, I'm going to be making 3/4 inch mortises. So I spend the time to go through and mark all of them. This is the mortising jig that I use. You can see I have a fence system set up with a stop, and then you can see those marks. You could see them through the hole, and then you can set those depth stops so that you can cut perfect mortises. And once again, I feel like this is the video of referring to other videos, but I have another video that shows you in depth how to make this mortise jig and how to use it. I'm not going to get into great detail in this video. You can see how nicely it cuts those mortises. I went through and was able to cut the 4 of them that were identical on one side, and then I could just adjust the depth of the jig and cut the other 4. So it's really simple, repeatable jig that gives you nice results every time. So this is a fairly large 3/4 inch straight cutting bit, and it's fairly new, so it goes through this pretty quickly. I could just remove that clamp that had held in place, and you can see how nice those mortises are, and they line up with my marks. So once that's done, I'm cutting these down to final length. This coffee table is only going to be 14.5 inches off the floor, so it's very short but pretty long. And then to cut the tenons that will go on those mortises, I always do a test tenon because I cut these on my radial arm saw because my shop isn't tall enough to use my tenoning jig. Once I have a nice close fit like that, I know the depth of the radial arm saw is set properly. You can see I have it raised so it only cuts down a certain amount, and I could go through and kerf cut all of these pieces, and then I kerf cut them fairly close together so there's not a lot of cleanup on the tenon. Once I had all my tenons, I could go through and square off these holes. That's the one downside to that mortising jig, is it does leave rounded holes, but cleaning them up is fairly quick work with some sharp chisels, especially the top edge, because you can break through the top and clean it up fairly quickly. So I just go through and square off the holes down to the bottom. These are like 1.25 inches deep. And then once I have a nice fit, the repeatability of the stop on the radial arm saw and the mortising jig means that all these pieces are interchangeable. So if they fit in one, they'll fit in the other. So then to sure up that tabletop, I'm going to be putting some cross members underneath of it, and I'm just using some leftover stock from the cut off ends of the tabletop. So this is about 7/8 of an inch, and I just ripped it into 2 1/4 strips to match the thickness of the rails. I went through and marked I'm only going to put 3 in this. You can see my length, I divided it by 4 to get 3 equal compartments so I could cut the dados. Like I said, they're 7/8 of an inch. I have a stop set up on my table saw so I could cut that dado, flip the piece, and then cut the one on the opposite end, as well as cut the other 2 on the other apron, which is great because this will give me perfectly symmetrical and parallel dado cuts, which means the tabletop will not only be square, but when it comes time to glue it up, it essentially squares itself if these holes are in the right spot. So you can see I could flip it and just cut the other ones, and they're pretty much perfect. The middle one, my table wasn't long enough to cut, so I had to freehand cut that with the miter jig, but since I had it marked, it was easy to line up the marks and get everything in place and then cut that as well. I could reassemble this table after that. So this was invaluable because of the thickness of these aprons. I didn't have to worry about warping or bowing on either of these, so they were perfectly spaced. I can measure in between those 2 dado cuts, cut those slats down to the right width, and then with it dry fitted together, I'm not gluing the legs yet because I still have some work to do on the legs. I could just put some glue on either end and slide these pieces into place and clamp them together, and then I let that set up overnight as well. And that is going to be the end of this video. The next part of the video is going to be this is going to have a shelf, so I'm essentially going to be making another tabletop for the bottom, and that will be part 2.